Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Our conversation this afternoon around measuring and personalizing learning loss and growth recovery with a great AASA partner, Ecker Group, and John Gatta. In appreciation for Wallace Foundation's amazing support of AASA What Works in Leadership webinar series, I want to personally thank all of my colleagues at AASA and the Wallace Foundation for allowing conversations like today's to take place. We know these are unprecedented times, and we know we all want to do well by all of our students. And so understanding the and personalizing learning loss and growth recovery is one of the most important things that we can consider when we're doing our work in a very intentional manner. I'm Dave Schuler. I have the honor of serving as a superintendent of schools in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, and I'm a past president of AASA. Allison, if you want to move the slide. We have a great opportunity to, as AASA, the School Superintendents Association, to focus on making sure that we're providing the appropriate supports and resources for all of our superintendents and school leaders during this time. In addition to being a past president of AASA, I have the privilege of serving as the facilitator for our Redefining Ready movement, which is our national movement to focus on what a student really needs, and a lot of the stuff that John's going to be talking about today that go beyond a simple test score and focusing on what the research actually says that it means to be college, career, and life ready. In addition to those initial set of indicators, we've now produced and rolled out elementary and middle school readiness indicators, which are research supported as well. I've been a superintendent for a long time in 3 different districts, and I just love learning with all of you and with presenters like John about this work, because it makes it a much more effective leader. So as I've mentioned, our presenter today in the conversation we're going to have is with Dr. John Gatta, who's the CEO of Ecker Group. He's also a professor at Northwestern University and a former director of research there. I think you will be as impressed with John and the work that ECRA has done as I am. And I'm really, really looking forward to jumping into our conversation today. To set the context for what we're going to talk about, we thought we'd start with a short couple-minute video that John and his team put together. So let's run the video.
As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, educators overnight were forced to pivot their instructional programs to support remote online learning as the world began mitigating the spread of COVID-19. Educational communities came together to accelerate innovation, to provide continuity of learning, and to ensure all students continued to thrive. Now, as a new school year begins, a vital question remains. How much learning loss has occurred, and how do we ensure the students recover?
Without the ability to measure and report learning loss at the individual student level in a way that recognizes the uniqueness and personal context of each student, it will be difficult for school leaders to understand the impact of their efforts.
School closures have revealed the inequities among students' remote learning experiences, their resources, and their overall ability to learn at home. This raises the stakes in terms of being able to measure student growth in a more personalized way. As students safely return to school, the question we should be asking is not how does one student's back-to-school performance compare to the state or national averages, but rather, how does that student's performance compare to his learning trajectory leading up to the pandemic?
Personalizing the measurement of student growth and learning loss requires that schools develop separate learning trajectory models for each and every student within their district. Aligning personalized learning models with personalized measurement systems will allow teachers to meet students where they are and to implement a plan to monitor their recovery.
Only then can we effectively develop learning and growth recovery plans for students.
The essence of growth recovery is understanding how student growth rates have been altered by the pandemic and amplified through the influence of personal dispositions, social emotional competencies, and other contextual factors. The ability to measure learning loss and monitor growth recovery against personalized benchmarks allows students, teachers, and parents to meaningfully collaborate when developing growth recovery plans in order to match students to interventions, programs, and experiences that recover learning losses.
At PBL, we believe a personalized approach to student growth provides a more actionable framework. There will be students whose learning trajectory is below pre-pandemic levels, but learning loss is modest enough that a targeted and differentiated growth recovery plan may allow them to catch up quickly. However, there will likely be a large number of students that start the school year significantly below where his or her pre-pandemic growth rates predicted. For these students, learning loss has occurred, and a comprehensive and personalized growth recovery plan will be needed, along with a commitment to rigorously monitor an individual student's recovery over a longer period of time. From a district leadership perspective, aggregating individual student learning loss by school, grade level, subgroups, and programs provides insights into how to allocate district resources effectively to achieve growth recovery.
The current public health and educational environment caused by the COVID-19 pandemic is likely the biggest leadership challenge superintendents will face in their careers.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about how to personalize student growth, measure learning loss, or build growth recovery plans for students, let's chat. You can find me on Twitter at @Gatta. We'll talk to you soon.
John, I think that was a great way to frame the conversation and create the context. And just as we begin the conversation we're going to have today, all those people that are on the call or on this webinar, if you want to go into chat and put in your position and where you're from, that can always be fun and helpful to see where people are from. And then I will be monitoring the chat box throughout the conversation. So as John and I are having a conversation, if there are a question or a follow-up that you want to ask, just please put that in the chat box as well, and I'll be monitoring that on a regular and ongoing basis. So John, as we shift into measuring and personalizing learning loss and growth recovery, it seemed like the conversation that we wanted to talk about today really was broken into 3 different buckets. And the first bucket on personalizing the measurement systems, the second really leading that growth recovery, and then third, which is just so critically important, engaging students and their parents and guardians. So why don't we start off by talking a little bit about personalizing measurement systems.
Great. Well, thank you, Dave. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to all the AASA staff for all the support in putting this webinar on. And thank you to all the participants. I know that this is a very difficult time. There's no doubt about that. And as the video said, Rich Voltz in that video, that for many, this is likely the biggest leadership challenge that many education leaders will face in their careers. And as you begin to think about bringing students back and opening buildings and beginning to get back to some normalcy or some rhythm as it relates to education and the way that we deliver instructional programs, what we're really focused on, and what I've been focused on my work, is how do we begin to think about measurement throughout all of this, because it's really important to answer that vital question of how much learning loss really has occurred. And I think the piece to recognize is that this pandemic has put every student on their own personal journey, right? Every student is on their own journey through starting to navigate this pandemic, and not only in their lives, but in their educational experiences. And so as we think about measurement, we've been talking about personalized learning for a long time, right? We've been talking about how important it is to align the way that we teach and develop students into to their interests, their motivations, their competencies. And there's a lot of innovation that will come out of this pandemic on the instructional side, but there's also a lot of innovation that will come out on the measurement side. And so the way that we're going to help students recover from this pandemic is that we really have to think one student at a time. And we have to start transitioning our mental models away from what we've been taught for so long, which is how does a student compare to a national benchmark or to a state benchmark or even a district benchmark, and recognize that every student's learning trajectory leading up to the pandemic was different, right? And so when we think about the impact that the pandemic is having on students, we can't look at that through the lens of, well, are they meeting a state or national benchmark? We really have to be more scientific in our approaches and say, what was the learning trajectory of individual students leading up to the pandemic, one student at a time, and then look at how the interrelationships of student dispositions and other contextual factors have interrupted their learning and ultimately impacted their learning trajectory. And so if you think about charting learning trajectories one student at a time, and then overlaying that with the personal context of every student, their social emotional competencies, their interests, their goals, their motivations, we can begin to have a more whole child perspective on not only where students have been, where they've come, but ultimately the path that they're on as we begin to engage back in instructional programs. And we know this, right, as researchers, as practitioners, as policymakers, we know that there are a variety of factors that influence student growth, right, or student learning. And for a long time, that ran under the label of the achievement gap. But we are now starting to even broaden our notions and recognizing that there are lots of contextual factors in addition to demographics related to other competencies of social emotional learning and dispositions and learning styles that all impact the learning rates of students. And so the fundamental takeaway with this is learning loss is personal, and we have to transition our thinking away from how does a student look against national, state, or even district benchmarks to how does a student's growth, development, and learning trajectory during the recovery of the pandemic look like it did leading up to the pandemic. And that's the fundamental piece, so that we can really look at every student compared to the trajectory that they were on before COVID-19 interrupted their learning. And so there's been a lot of advancements. So this is somewhat of a technical topic, but I'm going to keep it sort of really straightforward here. There's been a lot of advancements in the measurement community, specifically around predictive models and machine learning, to now it is a reality for school systems to be able to analyze one student at a time and be able to create a personalized set of benchmarks for each and every student so that you truly can look at how is a student's learning trajectory post-pandemic compared to their learning trajectory pre-pandemic, and are they on that same trajectory, right? And so the way that that's done, this is just meant to be sort of a conceptual motivator, is we do have data on individual students, and we have lots of data on individual students. We have assessment scores, we may have social emotional learning, we may have grades, we may have attendance, we may have a lot of pieces of information that help tell the story of an individual student, right? We can use predictive models to help us uncover the patterns that exist within that data to ultimately create personalized projections or personalized learning trajectories for each and every student. In doing that, we can then create these projections, which in essence, if you think about sort of the scientific method here of, you know, in other industries, we can sort of run randomized controlled trials where we're hearing about it in the news all the time. I mean, to think that the general public would be so in tune with things like randomized, you know, double-blind, you know, controlled trials and phase 3 trials and all these things that happen in other industries, that is a result of being able to randomly take patients and give some COVID-19 therapies and some placebos and to see what, you know, what actually works. In education, we can't really do that, right? Because we can't say that certain students get some interventions and certain students don't because of we want to evaluate certain interventions. But as scientists, what do we know? We know that if we can track the progress longitudinally of students over time, right, and compare each and every student to themselves, using every student as their own control, right, that we can answer really, really important questions as it relates to the impact that various external events or programs or interventions are having on student growth and learning. And so the idea here is we analyze students' histories, we use that to create a personalized projection that represents what would an individual student have performed at what level if their learning was not interrupted by COVID-19. Then we can compare that to where they actually ended up, right? And we can express that difference in terms of learning loss as an effect size. And so the benefit of that is that we can leverage decades of educational research on effect sizes to be able to make judgments about where a student is on their journey and how much impact did COVID-19 have. Because we know, and we'll talk about this in the next section, is the effects of the pandemic have been very asymmetric. And we know that already, right? We just don't know the extent of that. And we don't know how within our school districts we can have better visibility into that asymmetry. We know that some students will have thrived through this pandemic, some will have kept pace, but some students will have fallen really far behind. And so at the foundation here is, can we have a measure, and what a COVID-19 impact measure at the individual student level in the metric of an effect size that we can use to start to build up a framework for leadership to lead this effort within their district. And so keep that in mind as we talk about how we lead this effort, that at the foundation of this effort is being able to quantify at the individual student level where students are now compared to the trajectory that they were on leading up to the pandemic, and try to keep that as a framework as we talk about how to create actions and how to lead this effort within your school district.
John, I think something that is just so important to emphasize is what you just talked about, that depending on the grade level and depending on the subject, that learning loss could look very different per each student in different spaces, right? Like a student who is just learning to read when we went remote is gonna, I would respectfully suggest, have a greater likelihood of a larger learning loss than a high school junior who may have experienced, classes that they were able to finish up in the spring that may not directly build upon or scaffold up for that following senior year. You know, outside of really math and world language, a lot of high school classes may not build upon the foundation that was done that previous, trimester or last quarter of the year. Any initial reaction to that?
Yeah, absolutely. We're already seeing with all the research that we're doing and all the data analysis that we're doing with all of our district partners, we're recognizing some of those patterns. We're recognizing some of the patterns that you've suggested about the impact of lower grades being different than higher grades, but we're already seeing a pretty large differential impact in subject area, that more skills-based cumulative subject areas like mathematics are showing much larger learning losses than, let's say, reading, but that interacts with the grade level. So reading at higher grade levels are showing lower learning losses than, let's say, reading at lower grade levels, but mathematics is showing learning losses across all grade levels. And so it's a really important conversation. And then we're also, although we're in the very beginning stages of this, we're also starting to identify that some of that can be explained by some of those other contextual factors, social emotional competencies, other factors that relate to the student's home environment, demographics, all those pieces. And so I think it's a really important conversation to keep top of mind, that we really have to be more sophisticated about how we measure progress. And that's, that really is the key of this. And we have to really be situating it within this whole child context. That's the
and I think, even when we're coming out of, thinking about this from a post-COVID experience, we still are going to have students who don't perform as they were projected to perform, right? So to be able to create those structures and systems and put them in place, now, knowing that they will benefit students in schools way into the future, right? We know that, especially students who, leave in the spring, if they don't do any educational supplemental work over the summer, many of them do regress slightly at the beginning of that next school year, right? And so being able to look at what is projected versus actual performance, I find just to be a really, really useful metric. And to to what you talked about earlier, what it allows us to do is to be more sophisticated and intentional about providing interventions and systems and structures in place, so that while we're looking at each student as an individual, we don't have to necessarily take the time to create an individual plan for every one of the 11,000 students in my district, right? And so that's where I just find it really, really interesting as we identify, you know, that learning loss, now to think about how do we lead for that growth recovery.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly it. And so, should we move ahead to? Should we take questions as we go along on this topic? Should we move?
I think let's continue the conversation, and you know, if people have questions, let's you know, please feel free to put them in chat, and I'll continue to monitor that. I think, I mean, I thought the level of detail you went into, while still making it simple for those of us who are not statisticians, was epically awesome, John. So thank you for that.
That might be the best description I've had of a presentation. Epically awesome. I love it. So as we think about the work, though, as school leaders, as we start to reopen our schools and start to bring students back on campus and start to scaffold instructional programs and start to think about how do we lead this effort within our districts. The key piece of this is adopting a framework, right? You can't lead this effort as such a massive, daunting effort without adopting a framework that you're going to operate under. And so the nice thing about personalizing our projections for each and every student and then quantifying learning loss as sort of this difference between where a student was projected to be and where they actually ended up based on their own historical performance, right? We end up with this basic building block of an effect size that we can aggregate over any structures. So as leaders, we can have much better visibility into our system so that there begins to be a clarity about where we need to direct resources. Because in school districts, you know, we talk about strategic planning all the time in schools. And yes, it in somewhat is about direction, but strategic planning more so in schools is about how do we optimally allocate resources for maximum return on student outcomes and student growth. And so in order to do that, we have to have visibility into where are these pockets. And so one of the ways that we can do that is by adopting a framework. And so it's very easy to go from this individual student where they were projected to be to where they were actually ended up, to impose a set of actionable thresholds at the individual student, but even at the aggregate or the group of students, right? So that we can start to scaffold our programming and align resources where they're most needed. So at the highest end of this is there will be students, all of you will, if you were to run this kind of a framework within your school system, there will be students, believe it or not, that are doing better in this environment than they were at school for a multitude of reasons. And so in that scenario, in this actionable threshold, that's this blue learning growth where the growth is actually better than pre-pandemic levels. And so for those students, continuing to supplement them with remote or in-person enrichment is going to be a viable alternative. But you may not have to do anything, you know, systemically or structurally, right, at the district or building level. A lot of that's going to be about differentiation and making sure that we meet the needs of those students, but they will have proven that they've been able to grow through this pandemic. Then you're going to have students whose learning growth is consistent with pre-pandemic levels, meaning that they're not outperforming where they've been, but they seem to have been able to get into a rhythm, and they seem to be able to maintain their learning rates that they were experiencing pre-pandemic all the way through the recovery. And again, for this group of students, we should be able to support them and continue to provide rigorous in-person or remote instruction. So focusing on what we've always focused on, high quality, rigorous programming for these groups of kids is going to be, you know, I think a winning strategy. The most important pieces are the bottom two, right? Because these are sort of degrees of learning loss and degrees of growth recovery that likely will have to be dealt with in two different ways. So the first one is learning growth is below pre-pandemic levels. And so what we mean by that, again, from an analytic standpoint, is given a student's history, their performance on a multitude of indicators across multiple points in time, they are underperforming where their personalized projections would suggest they should be performing if they were continuing that trajectory that they were experiencing prior to the pandemic. And so for this group, again, just like differentiated or targeted sort of interventions or enrichment might have been appropriate for that blue group, this group, while they are experiencing learning loss, their learning loss is likely not at a level severe enough that you would have to do something really, really drastic. You could target them through other kinds of support interventions and other kinds of activities. But that bottom group is where learning growth is significantly below pre-pandemic levels, right? And so this is the group that they really have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the gap between their projected learning trajectory and their actual learning trajectory is so wide that it's going to take a comprehensive approach, it's going to take a personalized approach, and it's going to take a longer term commitment, right, to get these students back on their learning trajectories. And that's where the final stage of this conversation later on, which how do we engage students and parents, becomes really, really important. Because, you know, the old cliche, it takes a village, is certainly relevant here. And so we have to make sure that we are giving every student the support that they need in a very personal way, but in a way that engages them and engages their family, so that we can get that learning trajectory back on track. And the great thing about a framework like this is at every time we assess a student, however we're assessing them, is we can look at here's the trajectory that they were on, and are we bending that trajectory back to get them back on track, right? And so once we do that, then we can really start to run this across various structures in our district. So if you're a really large school district, if we have any large ones on the webinar, you may be interested. What's that?
We do have some large districts that are on the webinar.
So when you think about how your systems are organized hierarchically, right, you may have some version of a network where you have collections of schools. So at the highest level, you're certainly going to want to know, are there certain networks within our school system that seem to have larger learning losses than others? And so again, the way that we're doing this is we're looking at every single student, one student at a time, expressing the difference between they were projected and actually be in the metric of an effect size, and then rolling that up and looking at trends so that we can look at that COVID-19 impact that is in the metric of an effect size. Then we can use well-established educational research thresholds along with, you know, statistical tests to basically run a learning loss test to say these are areas that are keeping pace, these are areas that are falling behind. So at a network level, you can really have visibility into where that conversation needs to start about resources. You can also cut across, so that's sort of like a vertical look. You could also cut horizontally across the district to look at the various grade levels to say, are there certain grade levels that are keeping pace better than other grade levels? Do we have to think differently about primary or intermediate grades than middle grades and high school grades? What this does is it creates a clarity around your leadership and helps to inform the allocation of resources so that you can ensure that schools and buildings and networks have the resources they need to lead this effort locally. But in addition to that, we're going to want to look at other variables as well. Certainly, we're going to want to look at some of those contextual or demographic variables, and this gets into that asymmetry piece of, even though there may be differences at network levels or grade levels or building levels, as you begin to get more granular about the reporting of the information, you are going to notice that certain subgroups of students have experienced larger learning losses than others. And obviously we can think about the interaction of these pieces too, that, you know, certain subgroups within networks or within buildings, within grade levels, this can be sliced and diced any way that it needs to create the kind of leadership action that's necessary to to ensure growth recovery of students. But what you can see through this kind of a framework is right at a glance, very easily, you have visibility into pockets of the school system that really need more support and some that may need less support.
Hey, Hebel, will you do me a favor and check your latest email?
Oops,
Because
Kathy,
Laura
I think
needs
you're...
the ID numbers for those GRIF students, and I think I...
Sorry about that. Thank you, tech support. Sorry about that, John. I was going to say, I wanted to just mention, you know, when you talk about resources, that can also include time, right? So
Absolutely.
what you're showing here could allow adults to be much more intentional about the use of their time.
Those are the right
Oops,
ones.
tech support, if you could, thank you. So I just think that's important to remember, like the intentionality of time could be really is important as to be considered as a resource. So continue, John.
Right. No, I think that's a great point, Dave. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think most of the participants on this webinar probably agree that that is likely some of the most scarce resource they have right now is time.
Yep.
So, you know, when you think it's a basic sort of truth of the universe, right? If you're doing something, you're not doing something else. And so choosing how to direct your time as a lead, and not just as the teachers or the people working directly with students, but as a leader, choosing wisely about how you direct your time and what you choose to focus on is incredibly important. And so I think that's a really great insight, Dave, and something that's often overlooked, that we think about resources just as financial resources, but in this time, I think allocation of time might even be more impactful.
Yeah, I agree completely.
And then the other really interesting thing, and we've started to do this with some of our clients now, in that now that the school year is underway in most parts of the country, there are school districts now that have sort of restarted their assessment programs, and they have begun to assess students now as they've entered the fall. And they begin, and whether they're in a remote environment, whether they're in a hybrid environment, whether they're in a full back to school environment, they're starting to assess their students, and they're starting to uncover not just the answers to questions about how much impact there was in the past, but now they're starting to uncover, although it's early on because it's the fall, they're starting to uncover that some of their efforts are starting to be more impactful than others. And so one of the great things about a framework like this is, as you begin to scaffold your support systems and your delivery systems, again, whether you're a hybrid environment, whether you're a fully remote environment, whether you're a fully back to school environment, being able to tag students that way and being able to have insight into the impact that various approaches are having on this growth recovery conversation is really, really meaningful, because it gets back to this allocation of resources and return on investment conversation, and how do we spend our time conversation of, if we can understand the impact of our efforts earlier, and we can pivot quickly, and we can innovate faster, we're going to be in a position to help students in a more profound way. And so that's really exciting as they think about not only looking at the impact that's happened in the past, but prospectively looking at, now we're making changes, and here's the impact that we're seeing on these learning trajectories, I think is really, really important. And then you can wrap this even in a larger standpoint to say, given the learning trajectories, then how do we know all these other pieces fit together about things that we know impact ultimately the student's ability to be able to get back on track? And those are things like attendance and grades and social emotional competencies and other academic and non-academic indicators. So that's that contextual piece. And so the last piece of this then, if you consider those visuals that I gave you about sort of running those growth and learning tests throughout the system to identify on that framework of higher than expected, expected, lower than expected, and really lower than expected, you can consider drilling down into that even further. So ultimately, we want to be able to get down to the individual student level. And so the ability then to be able to dig all the way down to the individual student level and isolate individual students within a particular classroom, a building, a program, to identify specific students that are either blue, green, yellow, or red under that framework, and then be able to look at additional pieces of data related to those students and begin to engage them and their families around this conversation of growth recovery, which is the topic of the third part of this webinar, is really, really impactful. And we're starting to see the impact of that already. And I think that engagement piece is going to be the key to ensuring that that all students get back on track.
Hey, John, there was a question that I had when you first started this section out, but I didn't want to interrupt your flow. You know, when you talk about significantly underperforming versus predicted,
Right.
what are you using for that statistical number, you know, for what it means to be significantly below?
So that's a great question. So, so we always, as you can imagine, we use a very evidence-based and scientific-based process for doing this. And so at the core, I'm going to answer this question. So at the foundation of this, right, is this effect size at the individual student level. So if a student has an effect size of 0, right, it means that their learning trajectory is consistent with pre-pandemic levels, right? If it is positive, it means that it's their learning is actually accelerated according to pre-pandemic levels. If it's negative, it means it's below, right? And so that's what you're seeing with some of these different colors. So the question becomes, how do we decide, right, what is low and what is really low? That's where we turn to research and statistical testing. So in order to be either yellow or red or blue, right? So because in order to be something higher or lower, we're talking about the lower standard, so I'll stay there. So in order to be able to determine whether a district's current learning is below pre-pandemic levels, there's 2 conditions that have to be met. The first condition is that it has to be outside the realm of statistical significance, right? So there's a whole framework of statistical significance that basically is able to discern variation that's typical, because the universe is a very imperfect place, and there's variation in learning trajectories that don't mean anything, it's just variation, right? And to discern that variation from variation that really is indicative of a change of trend. So that's the first condition that has to be met, and that's just letting us know whether there's learning loss or not. The second piece to quantify the severity of the learning loss, once we've achieved that statistical significance, that's where we turn to the long established educational research based on effect sizes. And so there are many organizations that have done a lot of work in this area, whether it's like policy organizations like What's Works Clearinghouse, whether it's academicians like Hattie and his Visible Learning, whether it's other kinds of academicians that do those, that look at those. We're able to put thresholds. And so where we have set those thresholds, given the framework that we're under, is if you're greater than 0.3 effect size so negative 0.3, then you're yellow, right? So if your effect size is greater than negative 0.3 in absolute value, you're going to be yellow. If your effect size goes even further and is greater than negative 0.6 in absolute value, then you go to red. And so that's the framework that we use to distinguish or discern between learning loss that still should be recoverable quicker and learning loss that likely is going to take a longer period of time.
That's great. Thanks. I appreciate that. Now, as we move into thinking about, now we've got all the information, right? How do we go about that process of engaging students and parents and guardians?
That's great. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. This is really the work that has to take place. You know, if students are really going to those that have experienced losses, if they're really going to bend that trajectory back. And so when we think about engaging students, parents, and guardians, it's about this idea of getting students and parents and educators, of course, there's 3 pieces to that, actively engaged in reflection and actively engaged in planning in a very personal way and setting goals about how we're going to get this, this back on track. We know, based on lots of research across a wide range of areas, that there are certain things that just not only interfere with learning and prohibit the acceleration of student growth, but we know that certain contextual factors will either act as protective factors, which will help, right? Or certain factors or contextual pieces will ask as risk factors. And understanding what are protective factors and what are risk factors so that we can build on that and engage students is really, really important. And so while I'm not going to go through all of the different pieces here, I did choose to highlight a few that have shown to really matter in our work with school systems, but also have a very established research base behind them that absolutely matter. And the great part about this is it's a way to not only engage in very evidence-based recovery planning, it's a way to engage. And so one of those areas is just getting students engaged in reflection and getting students engaged in thinking about themselves as learners, thinking about their experiences through this pandemic, and getting them to represent themselves as a learner and start to communicate with their teachers and other educators as to who they are as a learner. And so we have a lot of clients that, as part of a comprehensive personalized learner profile, are asking students to go in and respond to prompts that ultimately create personal statements that allow students to reflect on their portfolio as a learner, reflect on the experiences that they've had recently and even through the pandemic, but ultimately end with a representation of sort of here's who I am as a learner, here's how I learn best, here's what I'm good at, here's what I don't think I'm so good at, getting them to digest their learner profile for the sake of reflection. We know that reflection can have a really, really big impact on engagement of students. And so that's one thing that is tangible that can be an engaging activity for students that really helps sort of kickstart this process of building growth recovery plans. The second piece that we've highlighted is the interrelationship with social emotional competencies. And so the other piece that a lot of our clients are doing as they start to think through this, this planning at the individual student level and this engagement piece is asking students to respond to a self-assessment so that they can begin to have a little bit broader profile of the student as it relates to how well they're doing on certain social emotional competencies. And so whether they're aligned to CASEL or other frameworks, but responsible decision-making, self-regulation, social relationships, and all the competencies underneath that, like grit and all those other persistence. Having a better understanding as an educator, but also as a student, but also as a parent and a guardian, so that you can situate the interpretation of that growth learning trajectory, knowing what you know about their learning styles and their social emotional competencies is important to have a well-rounded inference on the student.
Well, I think,
Also,
John, I think to your point, AASA has an SEL cohort that we've developed because we understand as superintendents and school district leaders the importance of providing that SEL support to students. And during COVID, we're seeing so many more of our students who may have experienced trauma, and where we as school leaders now have to implement trauma-informed practices in a remote setting or hybrid setting for many of us. Just having parents be able to see that SEL result, because what we're hearing is a lot of our parents are seeing some anxiety in their students that the students have said has always been there, but hasn't been manifested because they were at school, right? And they weren't at home. And now that they are at home, they're seeing that anxiety level in a whole different way. So being able to see that through some sort of a dashboard or a tile like you just showed, I think really becomes instructive for families, but for the school as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it motivates that idea that a lot of districts knew early on, that start the back to school programming has to include a significant piece that deals with those social emotional competencies.
Right.
We know that if we can align certain activities or certain kinds of enrichment activities or support pieces to interests, that matters. We know that the more that we can personalize experiences to interests, that's just going to increase the probability and the timeline that we can get students back on track. And lastly, something that's been well established across adult literature, student literature, setting goals matters, right? If we can get students to set goals for themselves, be aware of the goals that they've set, be cognizant when they're interacting with their school environment that they have goals, that again, they're going to be in a much better position to steer that learning trajectory steeper and make sure that they're where they want to be in terms of their goals and their aspirations. And so,
yeah, two things on that, John, before we hop onto this next piece. One on the interest piece, I think it is so critical for us as school system leaders to ensure that our students have the ability to dream. And right now, our students can't dream what they can't see. And so by putting down some interest and doing interest surveys and seeing how consistent and how tightly aligned what a student's thinking is with a parent's thinking is just so incredibly important. And, I think it's incumbent upon us as leaders to, plant new dreams in the minds of our children. Because if you're living in an apartment on the north side of my district where you might have multiple generations living together, all working to pay their bills, they're not dreaming about being an engineer, right? And so if we want to break the generational cycle of poverty that exists in so many corners of our great nation, it's up to us as school people to plant new dreams in the minds of our kids and their families, which is really important. And, what I love about, the goal setting piece is you can do that at any grade level, and it gives something for all kids to shoot for. And that becomes that aspirational point, right? And it makes it, hopefully, it's engaging and relevant, right? And if we set those appropriate goals and then students achieve them, we immediately are building that self-efficacy and confidence in those kids because they've done something successfully, right?
Absolutely.
And I know this sounds really silly, but I have a board member who said, when he was growing up, every day his mom made him make his bed right before he left for school. And he asked her one time when he's in his 80s now, but he asked her, he said, "Why did you make me do that?" And she said, "So you started your day completing a task and feeling good about the fact that you actually accomplished the goal you set out for yourself." And he said, I just never would have thought of that. And so I think having that opportunity for personal and academic goals that's baked into our current system becomes really, really important and critical.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And the other interesting piece as we've done this with districts, and sort of, again, here's another visual of, how students can actively manage, their own profiles and how districts can use these learner profiles of individual students is as students begin to manage their own learner profiles, and it's all, for lack of a better way to describe this, it's almost like the equivalent of like a LinkedIn starter kit, like for students, to get them thinking about how do I represent myself as a learner, and how do I think about all the different things that I'm good at, and ultimately the goals that I want. The interesting piece about this is, as districts have done this, oops, can I get that back? I screwed that up.
It's all good.
We'll
get it back up for you.
As districts have engaged in this process, as parents and guardians have accessed the learner profiles of their students, they're learning things about their own children that they didn't know. And that's, again, part of this engagement piece of once you give students, as you've described, Dave, which I love the way you described that, is giving students a space to dream and express themselves and set goals and look into the future. in a way that's very personal to them, that is just their own space and their own profile, they start to open up in ways that they don't open up with necessarily just a conversation with their father, mother, or guardian. And it's, I think we've learned that, and I think it's, it really is a great engagement tool, not only for the student, but for the parent and the guardian, and for the educator to be able to not only look up the learning trajectory that they may be on, but the ability to situate that learning trajectory against a multitude of other indicators just really helps the whole that whole conversation of making sure that students take some accountability for their own learning. And so, you know, that's the exciting piece of all of this. And so I think with that, I think we're at a point where we can have some further conversation or dialogue if there's any questions.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to your point, John, I think it's so interesting to be able to reimagine what education can look like. And I think, you know, where you started the conversation, I think is a great way for us to begin to close it. And again, if anybody has questions, please put them in chat. But what COVID has provided us the opportunity to do is to really create personalized pathways for every child in a way that in which they can feel supported and engaged. And I think, you know, what we did in the spring, you know, was not remote learning for those of us that did it. We had some pockets of excellence, of course, everybody did, you know, but we were just trying to get through it, man. It was triage and crisis, you know, and now we had the entire summer to really think about how we can recreate an educational model that supports each student where they're at, what they've lost, and then personalize that plan for that growth recovery to get them back on target from a statistical spot. And obviously all of us that are not statisticians want to move way above the target, right? And so I think what you've shared is fascinating stuff. You know, I love the data, so I'd love to dig in to the numbers and really look at what we're doing. And I think it provides just a great opportunity for us to ensure that everybody is thinking about that learning loss. And with your partners, I'm interested, how much time are they giving themselves to create that growth recovery? We've talked a lot about, you know, is it a quarter? Is it a trimester? Is it going to take an entire, you know, semester or a year and more? Right. You know, so what are your partners talking and telling you as far as the length of time for that growth recovery?
So, you know, as you can imagine, this is developing as the school year gets underway. But I will say that if you think about that framework and you think about that yellow kind of area, that warning area, that there's some learning loss, but that it should be recoverable faster. And then there's that red where it's a longer period of time. The conversations that I've had with partners is they're looking at, for students that fall into that yellow category, you know, they're looking to hopefully be able to do that growth recovery within the first quarter or trimester of the school year, you know, at maximum maybe a half a year. But then for students that are falling into that red or significantly below a category, they're really looking at this as a year-long process, that it's going to take the whole academic year and with comprehensive supports and deliberate engagement to you know, to really get that student all the way back on track. So I would say that yellow group, you know, a quarter to a trimester, as much as a half a year. That red group, a full academic year.
Yeah, and that's what I think, an academic year, maybe even plus, right? We might need some additional summer supports.
Absolutely.
To get there. Yeah. Anybody else I don't see any questions in the chat. It must be because John is just so gifted as an orator that he answered all the questions before you asked them.
I doubt that.
We'll give it another 30 seconds or so. John, this has been outstanding. I think this was so helpful to me, and I'm sure to everybody else on the call. And if anybody does have questions, please reach out to John. AASA is running a Leading for Equity webinar series Thursday afternoons, and I know Kelly put that information in the chat box. Those webinars have been just as outstanding as this one has been, so I hope you consider joining us. And we urge you, it is just so important for all of us to connect with each other and to build these networks, especially during these times. So, you know, all of our AASA webinars are recorded and they're all on our website, and you can find them under the Leadership Network portion of the website. We've done over 100 of them, and I review them all the time to get additional information and to learn with each other. So at this point, I want to thank John. John, I'll let you have the last word. Oh, it looks like there's something in the chat. Let me see if that's a question for you. Nope, just a great presentation comment. So John, any words that you want to wrap up with?
I'd just like to wrap up with thanking AASA for being such a great partner for so many years, and we look forward to continuing this journey. And thank you, Dave, for taking the time to frame all of this. I think all of us, you know, recognize the influence that you've had nationally on getting people really connected to this conversation of personalization and sort of redefining this notion of readiness, because I think that's the sort of the bedrock of what I presented, right, is redefining the very notion of what it means to be successful as a student, and to think much more personal, not only about the data that we're collecting, but about the benchmarks that we set. And so, you know, it seems almost obvious, but for whatever reason, all of us, me included, sometimes lose sight of the fact that, you know, one of the first things that we learn in graduate school, right, around assessment is that you have to align your sort of instructional approaches, right, and what you're teaching to the assessments that you're giving, right? Well, you know, from that piece of it, if we're truly going to engage in personalized learning, and we're actually going to personalize how we deliver instruction to students, then we don't have a choice but to personalize our measurement systems, because to engage in personalized learning without the secondary piece of personalized measurement really doesn't make sense. And so I would add, or I would close with that sort of final sort of motivational framework, that if we commit to personalized learning, we sort of have to commit to personalized measurement. Otherwise, we're a little bit out of alignment.
I love that. That's terrific. Oh, that's great. Mason County just indicated that they just published their personalized learning guide. So that's terrific. We also have a personalized learning cohort through AASA. So Jonathan, if you want to, I'm going to put my email in the chat box. If you want to reach out, I would be happy to make a connection.
And anybody that needs, has follow-up questions for me, you can either, you know, DM me, or just, you know, kind of hit me up on Twitter at JLGatta, or you can send me an email. My email is johngatta, JOHNGATTA @equigroup.com. Maybe you can throw that in the chat too, Dave.
What is that, John?
My Twitter handle is @JLGatta, JLGATTA. And my email is johngatta, JOHNGATTA @equigroup, ECRAgroup.com.
Did I get it right? Nope. Gatta. No, I got it. Yep.
I can't even see it. Where?
All right. equigroup.com. Yep, I'm good.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, just feel free to reach out, Jonathan. And I love the way you ended that. That, you know, if we are going to believe in personalized learning, we have to believe in personalized measurement, that it's research based. So you know, thank you very much, John. Thank you, AASA. Join us for our Thursday webinars, and have a great rest of your